Well, we came down here to follow Tim Martin and talk about his public debate that turns out isn't a public debate in any way whatsoever.
Right.
What it is Tim Martin wanting to talk and spout his usual old rubbish. If you look at his brochures, right, for this exact event, stop trying to con the public, right? And that's exactly what Tim Martin's doing. Now, I'm a former international trade negotiator. I've lived and worked in a dozen different countries, inside and outside the European Union. Tim Martin is talking about lowering all our tariffs to zero. He's saying that'll be great for everybody. This morning in Portsmouth, he said, £39 billion. If we leave the EU with no deal, we'll have that £39 billion, and that's £600 for everybody in this pub. If you divide that £39 billion by the population of Britain, I'm thinking, there's no way the government are going to give everything. He's telling people what they want to hear. He's conning them. He's not telling the truth. And when I tried to tell him and explain to him peacefully and calmly, with no swearing, no shouting, look, Tim, this is the way the WTO works. Just before December, I spent 2 solid days in Geneva with some of the leading experts in the world through a project I do on YouTube called Three-Blokes-in-a-Pub.
Oh, I've heard of it, yeah.
We've been to Brussels.
Are you guys part 2 of those 3 blokes?
I'm the middle guy from Three-Blokes-in-a-Pub.
Right, okay, right.
I'm just here on my own, under my own steam.
Yeah. So we've been to Belfast, we've been to Dublin, we've been to the government, we've been to Brussels, been to Gibraltar, Spain, and we travel around, we do the fact-finding. Now, I know that falling back onto WTO terms is an absolute nightmare. Tim Martin does not understand what he's talking about, or he's blatantly lying to his followers, and he does not like the facts being presented to him. So we did Portsmouth, and I did that once, first time. We got to Southampton, the security guy refused us entry under Tim Martin's instructions, doesn't want us in there. The security guy said, look, if you can get to Weymouth before the security guys get there, we can refuse you entry, but we won't throw you out. So we got down here early, we went inside, got ourselves a drink, non-alcoholic beer, and we're in there having a drink, and the security guys arrived, found the manager, and she asked us both to leave. And we're outnumbered probably 150 to 2 in here.
Fair enough. So what's your argument then? Can I give you a bit of a hard time and tease out your argument?
Please.
So what's your argument?
Okay, if you lower your import tariffs to zero, then what is the incentive for any other country in the world, whether it's Mexico, Brazil, China, Japan, South Korea, what is their incentive to negotiate a trade deal with you? Because under WTO terms, they have to apply an import tariff to everything they buy from the United Kingdom. So they get extra taxes, but we've already lowered they can sell us anything they want, cheap as chips. It doesn't even have to be of a certain standard. That's the big issue that Tim doesn't get. So if I'm a UK exporter, making a widget for £1, selling it today to Mexico or Canada or somewhere, under an EU negotiated trade deal, when we leave the EU, we also lose another 60 countries' trade deals around the world. So that widget for my customer in Mexico, as a UK manufacturer, becomes £1.25. Plus all the additional paperwork, import paperwork he has to do at his end.
Well, what I would say is if we lowered our tariffs to zero, I'm playing the devil's advocate here, then our leverage would go up because we'd be buying more from Mexico. Let's take Mexico, for example. So Mexico would look at us and they'd be making money hand over fist because they'd be selling us cars or something, or widgets. And so we go into the trade negotiation with them, and we've got huge leverage because we're a huge customer of them. They're making a lot of money from us. I suppose that might be the argument.
Interesting argument. The problem is, if you're in a trade negotiation bilateral between the UK and Mexico, and you threaten Mexico with a 10% import tariff, for example, on their products, you are then in breach of WTO terms, because WTO terms say you have to have the same rules for all of the people where you don't have a trade deal. So the only way to get away from that is to have a new trade deal. We've already got trade deals with the EU 27 and another 60 countries around the world that is the best trade deals you can get. Just the EU-Japan trade deal covers 1/3 of global GDP. Just that one trade deal.
I suppose the point that people might make back to that is that the barriers to trade in the 21st century are principally non-tariff related.
Sure.
So if we were to set our tariffs to zero unilaterally, then it would give us leverage over other countries like Mexico, in the sense that we'd be huge customers of theirs, so they'd want to treat us favorably. But they would continue to be incentivized to give us an FTA because they want to sell more to us.
See, if you think about it, there's not a single country in the world that has a zero import tariff regime. Not a single one anywhere. There's not a single country in the world that trades solely on WTO rules. The last one was Mauritania, and between 1% and 17% of their population is in slavery. Half their exports is iron ore, something we don't have. if we are put back onto WTO terms,
Yes.
British companies, British manufacturers, British industry will be devastated because we'll be flooded with all these cheap imports that we were just talking about from Mexico or Canada or South America or wherever they come from.
Yes.
All of that cheap imports will come in and they will be competing with British manufacturers and British industry. And if British industry can't compete, that means the government's losing corporation tax, they're losing income tax from the employees, they're losing national insurance,
Yeah.
and Tim Martin's just arrived, I see.
So what you're essentially advocating is a protectionist regime. Is that your argument?
But the whole world operates like that until you have a new free trade agreement, which lowers all of the friction on the borders, it lowers all of the tariffs, and allows you to trade more freely. That's the momentum of the world. That's
Yes, exactly.
the economic trend.
Exactly.
It's the trend of global economics.
So under WTO, the average tariff would be very small because that's the trend as you just
Well,
described.
it's 4% on a private aircraft, if you want to do that, or
Right.
it's 78% on grated cheese.
Right.
So all our dairy farmers in Dorset and Somerset and Wiltshire and around this area that are producing milk and they're making cheese and butter and things like that,
Yeah.
we're selling that right now into the EU. Friction-free, tariff-free, to the biggest single market on the planet. When we leave, the tariffs on some of those dairy products, 40%, 50%. Why will our customers out there right now buying our products friction and tariff-free pay an extra 40, 50% to buy from a post-Brexit Britain when they could buy it cheaper anywhere else?
Well, that's one side of the coin, isn't it? So if you're a dairy farmer, under that regime, there will be a total change to your business model. But for example, if you're a poor family who wants to buy cheese will be cheaper in the shops because we'll be able to, the competition for cheese making will be that much higher.
But that's fine. If something's cheaper in the shops because we've been flooded with cheese and we don't know where it came from, we don't know what's in it, is it reprocessed?
No. We continue to have our own rules to fight the sanitary
But what about
laws.
the farmers? Do you know 3.5 million people in the UK work in the agri-food sector? 3.5 million people. And your dairy farmer, half his income right now is coming from the EU subsidies.
Yes.
The government are not going to continue those past 2020. So first of all, when we leave the EU, farmers lose half their income overnight. At the same time as they're being flooded with new competition at very, very low prices. So all the farmers and the downstream processors, the butter manufacturers, the cheese makers, the yogurt makers, because it's not just the dairy farmer, it's all the downstream processors. There's the guy that makes the plastic pot that put yogurt in, and the silver foil lid that goes on the top.
So
the
what you're saying, what you're
manufacturer.
describing is protectionism. You're saying that the
Protecting jobs and
UK
liversities of British people.
Yeah, that's
in
why
the
it's called protectionism, right?
Yeah.
Protecting.
Yeah.
So, but the academic consensus is that unilaterally reducing our tariffs to zero, no matter what happens to the people who are importing from us, is a financial net benefit to us. Indeed,
if you've got a job and you've got some money,
indeed, this
is
is
brilliant.
No.
If you've got no money, you can't afford to go to the shops and buy stuff anyway.
No, overall, and by the way, we've just described how your protectionist regime would protect farmers who
Does
are
protect them
already,
today.
who are already. But for example, if we were to put up tariffs, but it would actually help the poor people. So it'd be a progressive policy to lower tariffs unilaterally. That's why I don't think they'll probably do it.
Nobody in the world,
Because the poor
because
people,
it's a disaster for Treasury.
Because the
Treasury.
poor people would actually benefit from it.
Yeah, well,
because poor people spend a disproportionate amount of their money, their income, on food.
Absolutely, and I totally get that. But the problem is, the poor people, a lot of them are on welfare, they're on benefits, they're getting housing benefit. All of this comes from Her Majesty's Treasury. That's where it starts. And it goes out to the NHS, and it goes to public services, and the police, and the local authorities. That's where all the money comes from. Corporation tax and income tax from businesses that are operating in the UK. If you take away those businesses by giving them too much competition as well as taking away the subsidies, you're losing that corporation tax to HM Treasury, you're losing national insurance, and you're losing income tax from the employees. Now, when HM Treasury's income is falling off a cliff, what do you think is going to happen in government spending to those poor people?
But this is the protectionist debate that we had over the past 50 years.
Hundreds of years, yeah.
And the protectionist debate has evolved from mercantilism to the current status quo and the direction of travel, which is to completely free trade.
Absolutely right. And that's where we need to be.
But this is what you're arguing against. You're arguing for protectionism. Because what you're saying is that to unilaterally remove our tariffs, i.e. to not be a protectionist, is not the way to go. That's your argument. Am I right?
For a tiny island on the northeast edge of the Atlantic Ocean, absolutely. If we were a major landmass and we could feed ourselves and we could grow sufficient food, right now we grow about 50% of the food that we eat in the United Kingdom. At a push, we could probably grow enough food and meat and dairy and everything else to feed about 70% of the UK population. So that means 1/3, nearly 30% of the UK population, we cannot feed by ourselves.
Yeah.
Right. The fact
So
that
it would,
we're part
it
of
would
the
make no
largest trade
sense.
bloc in the world.
It would make no sense to tax, therefore, imports of food.
Correct. We don't at the moment.
And
Within the largest trade bloc on the planet, with the most trade agreements of any other organisation that exists anywhere in the world,
Yeah.
we're trying to buck the overall trend of global economics and global trade, and we
Not
cannot
at
do
all.
that by ourselves.
Not at all, because like you said, the global trend is to reduce tariffs.
Yeah, and
by
have
the way,
new FTAs.
And at the moment,
Yep.
that's totally wrong to say that we don't tax food, because the tariffs for the European Union on food are some of the highest, as you've rightly just pointed
because
out.
we grow the massive amount within the EU. But the EU is not just EU 28 countries right now. There's another 60 countries around the world that we have trade agreements and cooperation agreements. For example, we've got no trade agreement with the States, but we have dozens upon dozens of cooperation agreements that help reduce those non-tariff barriers to trade and allow us to trade more easily. Things like not X-raying container ships as they come in through, not from the States to Weymouth, but from other places around the world.
So your argument is that as a small nation who can't sustain itself because it doesn't have the sufficient land mass, we should be a protectionist. Is that basically your argument?
No, I'm saying what we should be is part of a much larger organisation, a much larger bloc with our friends and our neighbours, and we should continue to develop that large trade bloc that's already the biggest on the planet and the most successful on the planet to include more and more and more nations. And that way, you have completely free, frictionless trade, and you don't need the protectionism.
But this is moving the debate onto whether we should be in or out of the European Union. And I'm happy to move on to that. But specifically on protectionism, you seem to be
I can't hear where you're coming from,
little bit muddled. Just to final and bookend this discussion, should we be a protectionist or not?
We cannot afford to be by ourselves, no.
So we should be a protectionist.
As part of the largest trade bloc on the planet, yes, we can be. So it's yes and a no. By ourselves, we can't.
Now, Tim Martin is saying in the Brexit scenario, we shouldn't be a protectionist. So you actually agree with him?
Well, no, he's saying in the Brexit scenario, you're right, in that point. Sorry, we'll get there in the end.